Berkeley Springs is the town, Morgan County is the county. We are in the eastern panhandle, sort of the very edge of West Virginia that is closest to the DC, Baltimore metro area. So there's a lot of energy here that is not elsewhere in the state. Berkeley Springs has been welcoming visitors for its healing waters since the middle of the 18th century. George Washington was like our first tourist. He wrote extensively about coming to Berkeley Springs. It's a tiny place with an outsized history and healing waters. So I got, I always was a historian, so I got rolled into the local history, but local in the sense of the bigger story about Berkeley Springs. I was never into genealogy, that didn't matter. It was why over the centuries have all these famous people come here, have hundreds of thousands of people come here? Why do they still come here? What do we have to offer?
This time on the Plutopia News Network, we ask the question, what do an artist, a retired CIA analyst, a theater owner, an arts activist, and an astrologer have in common? Maggie Duval provides the answer. It is her friend, Jeanne Mozier, who joins us this time on the Plutopia podcast.
But I would just like to start out with, we've known each other over 20 years, I think.
Oh, probably longer than that. When you first came to Morgan County.
Yeah. And my mom introduced me to you, but she'd already been talking about you quite a bit. And Mom was working, I think she was working for the planning, she was working in the clerk's office, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I got a kind of a firsthand view on what was going on in Morgan County, but I've always described you to people as, like a force of nature, polymath, a wizard, finger in every pie. You've been tireless in your work for the Arts Council, for the county and the town of Berkeley Springs. Why don't you introduce yourself to us from your perspective now? Now that you're retired, correct?
I am well, we're retired from the theater.
Okay.
So everything else still seems to be going on as usual.
Yeah.
So I'm retired from the only thing that was making me money.
Okay.
Not really true, but yes, our business is now in other hands.
Yep. And it's a young family?
It is, but they don't seem to be able to do what's going to need to be done, and they've already got it up for sale.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Well, this has been a rather difficult period for the movie industry, particularly. Not only are you not able to have people coming into your theater, but the entire industry has collapsed.
Exactly.
And there's no movies being made, which is even more difficult.
And that's something I wanted to circle back around to, too, when we talk about the arts. So, and you're also a prolific writer. I mean, you say the star was how you made money, but tell us a little bit about your scope of work with your writing.
Well, let me start with my favorite radio host created this introduction for me.
Okay.
Which I think is hilariously funny, and I like using it. And they play the I Dream of Jeanne music when I come on, the theme song. And then he goes, Ivy League educated, CIA indoctrinated, Morgan County marinated. It's like, okay, that works.
Yes. Yeah, who is that host, by the way?
I'm sorry, what?
Who was the host?
I didn't hear that.
Who is the host?
Rob Mario, and he was my very first host on radio, I don't know, 20 years ago, local radio. And then he changed stations, and we've gone back to my doing things with him again. Lovely.
Yeah. Well, I was catching up on some of your talks you've given, and there was one of the ones for Morgan County Today with Russ Mokhiber, and And I was really intrigued by, because I was going to ask you about what brought you to Morgan County. And you had talked about you and Jack coming and you were looking for a place to land. But you said something about if it had been up to you, you would have had an apartment in the Watergate and been the Secretary of State. So, but then here you end up in Morgan County. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, in 76, well, actually a couple of years earlier, Jack and I had bought in with some other people to a farm here in Morgan County. We actually bought it out of Winchester, Virginia. So when we first started coming here, we didn't even know Berkeley Springs existed, but we soon found out. So in 76, we decided it was time to leave life in the fast lane in Washington. We didn't want to commit to what that would have meant for us to continue there. So we outfitted a van and we set out for a year to drive around the country and decide where we wanted to live. And one of my friends had said to me, if you're going to do all that traveling, you should have a theme. And I'm a great believer in themes. And why I have a house full of stars. So we decided that since we were here in Berkeley Springs now, we would make hot springs our theme. So we traveled all over for a year. And I had always planned that we would come back and I'd live at the Watergate and I'd become Secretary of State. Jack always knew he wanted to come back and live in Berkeley Springs. So as we are arriving back after our year on the road, it was March 1st, 1977, just about dawn. We had been driving for 15 hours. And it was as if this lightning bolt hit me and said, "This is where you're supposed to be." I thought, okay. And, so I always felt that the angels of the springs summoned me and that my work was here. And that's what I've done is, tell the world about Berkeley Springs.
Well, tell us a little about Berkeley Springs, its importance. You talk about the vision for Berkeley Springs. It's a fascinating place. So fill us in a little bit on it.
It is. And Berkeley Springs is the town. Morgan County is the county. We are in the Eastern Panhandle, sort of the very edge of West Virginia that is closest to the DC, Baltimore metro area. So there's a lot of energy here that is not elsewhere in the state. Berkeley Springs has been welcoming visitors for its healing waters since the middle of the 18th century. George Washington was like our first tourist. He wrote extensively about coming to Berkeley Springs. It's a tiny place with an outsized history and healing waters. So I got, I always was a historian, so I got rolled into the local history, but local in the sense of the bigger story about Berkeley Springs. I was never into genealogy, that didn't matter. It was why over the centuries have all these famous people come here, have hundreds of thousands of people come here? Why do they still come here? What do we have to offer? When we first arrived, it was at the beginning of what I consider the fourth golden age in Berkeley Springs history. And there were various young people coming. We were young at that time. And within a month, we decided several things: to buy the movie theater, which was closed at that time, because we couldn't imagine living in a little town without a movie theater. And I went to dinner at someone's house here who said, "You know what you should do? You should start an arts council." And I said, "Oh, okay, I'm not really into the arts, but hey, I start things." It's something I do. So with, the same thing, it was May 1977. And I thought, well, we'll have a public meeting at the courthouse and see if anybody's interested in starting an arts council. Well, what happened was that 41 people showed up. I mean, this is huge in a county that at that time only had 8,000 people in it. And they looked around and it was like, wow, we had no idea there were all these other kinds of people like us here. And that was when the Morgan Arts Council was born, and quite literally, it changed the face of Morgan County. There was no art here before. I mean, you know, they were doing concerts at Cool Font, but there was no real arts presence. And this brought this whole community together, and we've just grown and developed. And now we have a 40,000 square foot art center, an enormous art presence, and over 100 working artists in the community. And recently, one of the sort of longtime local guys who has always been a supporter and friend from the beginning said to me, you know, the only reason you got away with doing all this is they didn't know what you were doing.
I like how subversive that is. That's awesome. I'm pro-subversive.
It was like, yeah. So last November, I gave a TED Talk at our local community college on social entrepreneurship, because I feel that's what really my work has been in Berkeley Springs. And I talked about 4 major organizations that I either revived or started that have literally changed the face of Morgan County. One of them is the Arts Council. The other was bringing the Apple Butter Festival back to life. The Chamber of Commerce got revived. And then we formed the Travel Council, which has made us a nationally recognized art town, romantic town. I mean, they keep giving us all these titles. So that's really been my work in Berkeley Springs in a nutshell, is using the nonprofit world, even while having a business and being part of the Chamber of Commerce and supporting businesses. It's not like anybody ever paid me to do this community development work.
Yeah, and but everything it's spun off from that, and you know, that vibrancy, that that life that was brought back to the town. That's kind of what I wanted to touch on, is to inspire others. You know, I know so many that you know, in the tech realm who, you know, with COVID and in the arts realm, COVID and everything. I had told them several years ago, before all this happened, I had this kind of vision of like a dandelion, you know, the seeds spreading off and planting in all these dying towns across, you know, like, why not revitalize these in a new way? You could put up your own networks, mesh networks or whatever. You know, Berkeley Springs would be a great model for people to study. So I really want to, you know, focus on that. But what are some words of thoughts, words of advice you could give for folks who are thinking this way now?
The number one piece of infrastructure that has to happen is broadband. Solid, reliable, fast, accessible broadband. Forget roads, forget anything else. And I think if we've learned nothing else from this excruciating period we're in right now, it's that you can stay connected. You can have a life. You can have a world wherever you want if you can be connected to the internet. And I think all those guys were geniuses who created this, who somehow downloaded this unbelievable idea from, you know, I don't know, the heavens. So that's what I would say is my number one piece of advice, is get connected. And then once you have that, you can do anything. And then particularly in small towns, it is essential to know that it takes people to make these happen. And it takes somebody, often just one person, to say, oh, I think I'll start an arts council.
Well, what, you know, one thing that's amazing is how How did you convince U.S. Silica to donate the ice house to the Arts Council? That was amazing.
Well, that's a great story, actually. You know, the building had been sitting basically unused for years. U.S. Silica was at that time owned by U.S. Borax. It had been a local company, but then it got bought by U.S. Borax. And Borax was getting ready to unload it. And as it happened, that particular building in the middle of town was not on the list of their assets they were going to be selling. So one of our board members, who happened to work for Silica at that time, said, "Jeannie, I think if you write them a letter and ask them, they'll give you the building." I thought, okay. At that point, you know, all we owned as an arts council was a small sound system and a box of T-shirts. So, okay, a 40,000 square foot building in the middle of town. Hey, no problem. So I told the board, I said, "Okay, I'll do this, but you guys are the ones who have to fix this building. I don't do that kind of work."
Yeah.
My role in any construction project is, do you think this should be blue or green, Jeannie?
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I do. So I wrote the letter. Within 3 weeks, we got back a response from Borax that said, "Here, $1, it's yours. Don't ask us for anything else." Again,
Wow.
but there was a downside to this, that there were individuals at U.S. Silica who had lusted after this building. Heaven only knows why. So they ended up firing the guy who was on our board. Who brought this to our attention. And he eventually left town, and it was all very sad, and I'll never forgive them. But that's how it happened. It came into our hands. The day we got it, we sat there and we pledged that the one thing we would never do is allow work on the building to interfere with programming art. And our mission statement has always been getting art out there.
Out there, yes, exactly. And, you know, thank God that it was before this sort of wave of development to turn it into all these yet another live workspace like we have all over Austin, right? And, you know, as all these art venues disappear right and left. And tell us, you know, because I remember when it was empty and nothing had happened really yet, you know, maybe the gallery was there, but what do you have in the ice house now?
Well, I do have to say to you, Maggie, as we have our digital media center up and running, as we do all of this stuff we do now, I want to say, gee, Maggie, too bad you were 20 years ahead of your time. When you did whatever we called it.
The first digital media festival or something like that. 1999, right?
Right.
Yeah.
We just got in the ice house. So you would be so proud. And, so right now, 20,000 square feet is renovated. We just launched a new 3-year plan to finish the top 2 floors, which will add another 20,000 square feet.
Wow.
Our first phase is we have to sprinkle the whole building because we can't do any more work until we get a sprinkler system through everything. So right now what we do is the gallery is booming. I mean, seriously booming right now.
Fantastic.
And probably 12,000 people a year come through the gallery, and we do rotating shows. We have a local co-op. We do live local theater. We do concerts. We do classes. We have the digital media center where, we have lots of visions about what can happen with that. So those are and we rent out space. I mean, people use it as a community center to have like the Uniquely West Virginia Wine and Food Festival is there. Big Festival of Light Psychic Fair brings 500 people a day there for a weekend. So people need to understand the ice house is this 1911 cold storage building. Right in the middle of town, the biggest building in town till they just built a new courthouse. So, you know, it was, and it's concrete floors, and you could drop a bomb right on the roof and it wouldn't even budge. So it won't be live workspace because you can't live in this building. It doesn't have any windows. You put in a few windows, but you know, so it changed the Arts Council in the sense that when you have a building, when you have something physical that people can relate to, it makes a huge difference. It also, of course, requires a whole lot more resources, and we had to get staff for the first time because volunteers, I don't care what anybody says, volunteers can't run a building successfully.
Oh yeah. Having produced a lot of events, you know, Scoop and John know, like the volunteer thing is like the bane of my existence.
Exactly. Somebody has to be in charge.
Yeah, exactly.
And they have to have a stake in it. So that's why the Star Theater ran so perfectly for 42 years, was because Jack and I ran it. We were there every weekend. We didn't have to go around people, oh, who's going to work this weekend? You know, it's like, I know, me and Jack.
Yeah. Well, and how great the Star was, because you were there, you know, it was your way to keep your fingers on the pulse of what's going on, to be a hub of activity, you know, really exciting. And then I wanted to say too, like, you know, also all the work you've done on grant writings and your interconnections you've made with the, you know, arts in West Virginia government. You know, I remember when I was on the Arts Council, when we were doing the, you know, the annual getting all the grants out, you know, and we had that like assembly line of all the paperwork on the floor. That was a thing of beauty. I've never seen that again.
It still happens.
Yeah.
Now it's digital. We get to send it. I don't think we even have to, well, maybe we have to send 1 or 2 copies on paper, but yes, it's still happening.
Well, we're going to, definitely direct people to studying Berkeley Springs. I wanted to turn now, though, because you are a preeminent, in my mind anyway, but a lot of people would say the same thing, astrologer, you know, which I have emphasized to people, I think is so amazing because it's informed, I feel, in so many ways by the work you did as an analyst, a CIA analyst. So you have this like big pattern, big picture view. Tell us about your thoughts on, what's been happening this year, what the election is going to bring us from what you said. Just go for it. I want to hear it.
Well, as you know, Maggie, I've been doing these oracles lectures once a year since 1977, talking about what the year to come is going to be like. And because my background, my long ago background, academically, professionally, I learned to be a trends analyst. I always did research. And then I discovered astrology, fortunately, after I'd left the CIA, or they probably would have never let me leave. And I discovered how easy it is to understand a trend when you have these objective dates. It's like, oh, okay, that's the day it's going to start. I got it. Now I understand. Well, these past couple of years, every year I get ready in the fall to start looking at the year to come. And I think, I don't want to do this anymore. People are going to hate me. There are so many terrible things coming, and I'm going to be the one who has to tell them about it. So this year, and I had seen this coming, so it was not a big surprise, but I do have to say that even though if you listen to my oracles talk for 2020, which was done in November of 2019, long before anybody had even a glimmer, I was saying things like lockdown and, the economy is going to crash and what was going to come after. And I have to say, I never, ever imagined it was going to be quite so literal.
Yeah.
Quite dramatic.
Yeah. I remember listening to that. I was like, oh, it's not going to be that bad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it started exactly on the right date. I was like, oh no, this is really going to be bad when it gets the first day right. So, the reality is the world had to change, and it wasn't going to change willingly. So I guess the cosmic forces, the great beings in charge of Earth said, oh, well, they don't seem to be getting the message. We better make it unavoidable. And things have changed. I mean, in one of the lines I used in my talk was, you will not recognize the world to come. And nobody got it closer to being right than that.
Mm-hmm.
So here we are, and now what's going to happen? Well, first of all, the detailed astrology from the beginning of October till election day is a nightmare. And even without all of the realities and the people casting doubt on the election and all that now, that's what the astrology says. Mercury is retrograde. We knew there were going to be breakdowns in everything. We know that, although interestingly, it ends on election day.
Wow.
We know that there's going to be questions afterwards. But when I look at the chart for the US Constitution, it doesn't look like the Constitution is going to be destroyed. It doesn't look like the revolution that these brain dead people seem to think they want. Because they don't know history. It's like, trust me, guys, nobody ever comes out good in a revolution.
Exactly.
Even the American Revolution, which was probably the best and easiest on record, lots of people suffered through that. So what gives me hope is that starting the middle of December is a 2.5 year period of progressive energy. And it is my personal observation as a historian, as an astrologer, that leaders have to fit the quality of the time. And that's why we have the leader we have right now, if we can call him a leader, because it was to be a time of chaos. And that's why, starting in December, he can't be the leader, because he isn't a progressive force, because he doesn't fit in it. So one of the things I do when I start looking at elections, and again, this is the political scientist part of me, I would argue with astrologers and say, look, the really crucial chart, if you're looking at a presidential election, is the Constitution, because that's where it's laid out. That's where it's defined. So what I have done over past years is do what is called in astrology a composite chart. Usually it's between two people, but in this case, I do it between a person and the Constitution.
Oh, wow.
Figure that, whoever has the best chart with the Constitution is going to win.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, the person who has the best chart with the Constitution is Kamala Harris. And it's like, okay, this is all about her.
Okay.
She has this elevated chart in composite with the Constitution. It talks about being a partner. It's like, okay, I got it. You've made your point. So that's sort of why I have hope. I don't know that it's going to be smooth, but I have a lot of faith just like I have faith in the strength of the waters in Berkeley Springs to get rid of the people who don't belong here and bring the good ones here, I have faith in the Constitution that it's going to protect itself, no matter how difficult that task is going to be.
Yeah. And well, is there an aspect too of, I don't know, one of the things I've been thinking about is how so many people, you know, there's so many people in despair. There's the fear at what's going to happen and all that. And I keep saying, like, how do we find ways to sort of find each other? Because there is a lot going on underneath it. Is some of the astrological stuff deal with kind of revealing, you know, allowing this to come forward? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Unfortunately, the dominant energy starting the end of June and continuing till the middle of January is Mars and Aries, and it's all about anger and war and conflict, and that's why what's going on is going on. That's why everybody is snarling and all of that. So what I think is that people, let's see how to say this, not freak people out too much. It's like, okay, kids, forget peace and love for a few months. I mean, that's not going to do it, because you're facing an opposition that is more than happy to mow you down and chop you up. So the other night after Black Panther's death, I watched the Black Panther again, which of course we had shown at the theater. It was hugely popular, and I think I watched it for 7 nights in a row there.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, my favorite part, because people talk about it as a revolutionary Black movie, which it is, but what it really is a revolutionary women's movie. And those women with their shaved heads and their spears, and they were like, where do I sign up? Exactly. So I was inspired. It was like, okay, kids, if you want a revolution, it can happen. So I think people, what they need to find is courage. They need to find their heart and their courage and move on. Because, you know, one of my projects currently is heading up the bicentennial in Morgan County.
That's right.
Our 200th year. And of course, nobody but me seemed to have noticed that. So I went into the county commission and I said, oh, do you know? And I have to give them credit. They just said, okay, Jeannie, here's this money, go do it. They said, do you want a committee? I said, no. Stephanie and I will do this. We don't need anybody else. Well, before I started doing all this work on the bicentennial, all I knew was the name Daniel Morgan. I knew the county was named after him. Well, after reading 3 biographies and learning about Daniel Morgan and forming the Danny Morgan fangirls, I was inspired. And this is a man. This is what one of his biographers called an uncommon common man with enormous courage and brilliant tactical genius, who won every major battle of the revolution. He was the greatest general of the revolution.
Oh, wow.
What was his name?
Yeah.
There are tactics that he invented in the revolution that are still being used today and considered groundbreaking.
Like what? Name a couple.
Well, he was probably the first guerrilla warrior.
Okay.
And he created a way of integrating different, like, riflemen with infantry and guys from different militias, because it was a very separatist kind of revolution where there was the Virginia militia, there was the Maryland militia. They didn't forming a national army was still going on at the end of Washington's second term. So, and his men loved him. I mean, they loved him. They didn't want to be run by anybody but him. So anyway, I decided Danny Morgan's my guy. And I'm going to emulate him.
Yeah, that's cool.
Revolution comes. So courage. Courage.
And that makes sense. And I think about, the image I've had in my head that, with all this change coming forward, the old order is dying. It's dying. And so the light's being shown upon it. And it's like this creature with fangs and tentacles. It knows it's dying, and it's gonna like lash out with every ounce of its being and drag as many people as it can down with it. So yeah, I get that sense. So like, stand up, courage, stand strong, and like, you can't like wish it away, I've seen a lot of that. And
well, there's a great story in the labors of Hercules. And people don't understand that the 12 labors of Hercules are actually keyed to astrological symbols, starting with Aries, going to Pisces. Well, the story that goes with, as it happens to Scorpio, is the teacher says to Hercules, there's this beast living in the swamp and eating everybody that goes by, and you have to get rid of it. But it was a 9-headed hydra.
Okay.
Do not cut off any of its heads. So Hercules, who was not good at listening to direction, goes out into the swamp. The hydra comes up. Hercules lops off a head, 2 grow back. He lops off another head, 2 grow back. And he says, oh, I seem to remember something about this. So Hercules, with his great strength, walks into the swamp, grabs the hydra, lifts it up to the light, and it shrivels up and dies.
Oh, nice.
And I said, that's it. That's the story. Mm-hmm. And I guess one of the warnings I have to give people is, yes, this is going to be a new progressive era. Yes, there's going to be all of this Aquarian energy, but don't expect it to be warm and fuzzy. It's not. Aquarius is not warm and fuzzy.
Absolutely.
It's profound, deep mental energy. And while I was sitting here this morning, I was thinking, how do I explain what the difference is going to be in the valued qualities in a world that is basically going to be electronic and digital? And I thought, it's that question they ask you when you're submitting things to newspapers and all. I am not a robot. Mm-hmm. Well, there it is. That says it all, is that how can you even ask that question? And you don't ask that question when you're dealing with people face to face. But when you're not, it's like, I am not a robot. Mm-hmm. It's going to be hard for people.
Yeah.
For old folks like me.
It's a good point. I mean, I think too about like all this deep fake technology of like, do you have any thoughts about that related to all this, where they're able to, through AI, map a face over somebody else's voice, that kind of thing?
Again, how do you do? When you think about it, Maggie, and it's really interesting in this period where we're being prohibited from meeting people face to face, much less so in places like Berkeley Springs that are sort of small places out in the country. But you get so many cues from people when you're in their presence. What their faces are, what their general aura is. And of course, the more sensitive the person, the more information they get. Well, that information, right. I mean, dangerous, and you have to protect yourself, and you have to be able to sort out what that information is. But that information is not going to be there. And it's going to be harder to recognize the good from the bad, to discriminate between the good and the bad, the positive and the negative, when the key question is, I am not a robot.
And that's an amazingly wonderful point, because I think about that. You know, you think about how difficult it is with text and email. How there's you don't get the nuance, so people take offense all the time. So, and you know, there's this people have been expressing the deep sadness that they feel that there's not, you know, they can't articulate it as such, but I think this is what it's all about. They can't pick up those cues. There's a, you know, it's a different kind of lack of connection. So do you have any, you know, I like too what you said about the small town thing, and it kind of circles back to what we were talking about earlier, that these are some of the ways that, you know, the people I know are like, how to reforge that connection again. It's like, why don't we go off together somewhere and, you know, and find some other way to do it? But that leaves everybody that's still in the city. What do you do with that?
Well, Maggie, you certainly understand. You've lived in a city now for quite a while. And I had this sort of inspiration when I was in Manhattan. You know, I lived in Manhattan for a year while I was going to graduate school. You know, we'll occasionally go back, and then about, oh God, I don't even know. It's like my life is 100 years ago or yesterday. But it was probably maybe 10 years ago. I won this national award. It did a big thing in Manhattan. And we were walking around, Jack and I were walking around, and I realized that even in Manhattan, people are limited to their neighborhood. You know, there are people in Manhattan where it's 5 square blocks defines their world, no matter how big a world there is surrounding them. So I think that that's what people in metropolitan areas need to regain, is that sense of, sure, my neighborhood may be filled with a whole lot more people than Morgan County is. I mean, we got 17,000 people in the county. There are probably, you know, there's like a building in Manhattan may have 17,000 people in it. But I think it's still that sense of, this defines my universe, and here's where I have to make my connections, because that is crucial, and it can happen anywhere.
Well, that's, you know, me being ahead of the curve, you know, unfortunately, over and over again in my life. I had a failed experiment. It was ahead of its time again, but I tried an experiment here in my little neighborhood. The other half of the duplex next door, the treehouse play space, I was hoping to have it as a communal place for art creating and, you know, meeting, and we did some things there, but it never quite caught on because people were still too outwardly focused until COVID hit. They didn't understand that kind of neighborhood, because that's what I'd seen forever, this idea of livelihoods, right? Lively neighborhoods. There's a little hub of like its own little arts council, and you know, and I felt really bad when it collapsed. But then again, I think that, you know, just ahead of itself, and at least it's planted a seed in people's minds. Like, you know, this is something that you can do as well. So, you know, we'll see what bears out here. But yeah, do you have, you know, I just wanted to, I know we have to wind it up pretty soon, I think, Scoop, but going back to the election as well, any thoughts on Russia and its influence, or you know, any thoughts there, and anything you've studied in that direction?
You know, let's see how to say this. Morgan County is, I mean, let me just say, in 2016, Morgan County voted for Trump probably 73%. Frightening concept. that means a lot of the people I interact with, you know, online, social media, are definitely in that camp. And they don't need, they don't need the Russians. They don't need the Chinese, you know. And so last night on the news, it was like, oh yeah, the Russians want to support Trump. The Chinese and the Iranians want to get rid of him. It's like, okay, sign me up for the Chinese and Iranian side. The world is the world. Is it really going to influence people? Yes and no, but I think that people need to just focus on getting your neighbor next door to vote. You know, trying to connect them to reality. I mean, there's endless, excellent articles that try to explore what is going on in people's minds. Astrologically, I've been talking about this since 2012, when the planet Neptune went into Pisces, and illusion, delusion, fake news, all of that came from Neptune in Pisces. And what has happened is it has dissolved the boundaries in so many areas. And when boundaries are dissolved in human consciousness, particularly with weak brains, Jack keeps telling me I should stop saying this. It's like demons are afoot. There are demons hacking the brains of humanity. And that unfortunately continues until 2025. It's the same energy behind addiction.
Yeah.
That's what addiction is. It's weak boundaries. So if people are going to survive, they A, need to strengthen their boundaries, and B, they need to know how to influence the weak brains to be thinking the right things. So, you know,
you talked about that's, you know, what addiction's about too. Also, I would say, and we're just about to wind it up here, but I would also say that, you know, we have the narcissist in chief in office. You see it all the time on Facebook or wherever, like narcissism, you know, narcissists versus empaths over and over again. It's like this huge topic, and all these therapists are making bank because that's been what people in my realm, myself, it's like, it's all been about the boundary thing. So thanks for reminding us of that. And with the getting our friends out to vote, we're going to have a show next week with our local Travis County tax assessor and voter registrar. And, you know, because that's exactly what I was hoping we could address. How do we get the information out there? How do we connect people so they don't feel like helpless and all that?
Right.
So,
and one of the things, and it infuriates me, is that one of the things that infuriates me is how ignorant people are of how government actually works. But you will know, you know, there's nobody doing this on a national level with voting. It's your local county clerks or whoever it is in your particular arena. How can you not trust them? I mean, I trust my county clerk and the voting in Morgan County implicitly. They're not going to mess it up. They're committed to making it done right. So that's what people have to understand. If you don't understand how the process works, go talk to your county clerk. Go talk to the girls in the office. Let them explain to you. And please, people, if you want to have a good election, volunteer to be a poll worker.
Exactly.
If there aren't people out there willing to go work the polls, there aren't going to be polls everywhere where people can go and vote in person. So one last thing, if we're getting ready to close up, we never talked about the writing, but you can find me, folks, at starwv.com. I have 12 published books on West Virginia, Berkeley Springs history, but also a novel called Senate Magic, which really is quite entertaining and talks about is based on a real U.S. Senate campaign in 1990.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. And also your wonderful Way Out in West Virginia, yes. The Oddities and Wonders of the Mountain State, which is an amazing, amusing read. So,
best-selling book on West Virginia. Published that first in, I think, 1999. We're in our 4th edition. It'll probably never get published again as a hard, as a paper volume, but it's good. People carry it around with them. Learn about West Virginia if you're going to do any traveling. That's the book to use. Right
on. Well, thanks so much, Jeanne. And I had fun, and it's great catching up with you too. And I hope that it'd be great. I'm hoping that we'd have you on one of our happy hours one of these days. That would be great.
Whatever you need me for.
Right on.
There. Thank you all. And it's wonderful to spend this time with you, Maggie.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.